Hi there. Welcome to Stories with Grandma Joan. I'm so glad you came. Today we are reading Chapter 9 of Pippi in the South Seas, and the chapter is called Pippi Talks Sense to Jim and Buck. Okay, here we go. The shark's teeth had only scratched Tommy's leg, and when he had calmed down, he still wanted to continue the climb to the big cave. Pippi twisted strands of hibiscus fiber into a stout rope and tied it to a stone. Then, lightly as a mountain goat, she hopped over to the cave and secured the other end of the rope there. Now even Annika dared to climb to the cave. When you had a steady rope to hang on to, it was easy. It was a wonderful cave, and so big that all the children were able to get inside without any trouble. "The cave is almost better than our hollow oak at Villa Villaculla," said Tommy. "No, not better, but just as good," said Annika, who felt a lump in her throat at the thought of the oak and didn't want to admit that anything could be better. She missed her family, didn't she? Momo showed the visitors how much coconut and breadfruit were stored in the cave. One would be able to live there for several weeks without starving to death. Momo showed them a hollow bamboo cane filled with the most beautiful pearls. She gave Pippi and Tommy and Annika each a handful of the pearls. "Nice marbles you have to play marbles with in this country," said Pippi. It was delightful to sit at the opening of the cave and look out over the sea glittering in the sunlight, and it was great fun to lie on one's tummy and spit into the water. Tommy announced a contest in long-distance spitting. Momo was terribly good at it, but he still wasn't able to beat Pippi. She had a way of forcing the spit through her front teeth, which no one else could imitate. If it's drizzling over in New Zealand today," said Pippi, "it's my fault." Tommy and Annika didn't do so well. "Northern children no can spit," said Momo with a superior air. He didn't quite consider Pippi as being one of the northern children. "So northern children can't spit," said Pippi. "You don't know what you're talking about. That is taught to them in school from the first grade, long-distance spitting and altitude spitting and sprint spitting. You ought to see Tommy and Annika's teacher. Man, can she spit. She won first prize in sprint spitting. The whole town cheers when she runs around spitting to beat the band." "Bah!" said Tommy and Annika. Pippi raised her hand to shield her eyes from the glare and looked out to the sea. "I see a ship out there," she said, "a tiny steamer. I wonder what it's doing in these parts." And she had reason to wonder. The steamer was heading towards Crocodile Island at a good clip. On board there were several South Sea Islanders and 2 white men. Their names were Jim and Buck. They were dirty, coarse-looking men, and they looked like real bandits, and that is exactly what they were. Once, when Captain Longstocking was in the shop where he bought snuff, Jim and Buck had been there too. They had seen Captain Longstocking put a couple of unusually large and beautiful pearls on the counter, and had heard him say that at Crocodile Island the children used pearls like these to play marbles with. Since that day they had only one goal, and that was to go to the island and try to get hold of a quantity of pearls. They knew that Captain Longstocking was very strong, and they also had a healthy respect for the crew of the Hop Toad. They therefore these bandits decided to take advantage of an opportunity when all the men were away on a hunt. Now their chance had come. Hiding behind an island close by, they had seen through their binoculars Captain Longstocking, his crew, and all the crocodiles paddle away from the island. They were only waiting until the canoes were out of sight. "Drop the anchor!" shouted Buck when the ship was close to the island. Pippi and all the other children watched them in silence from the cave up above. The men dropped anchor, and Jim and Buck jumped into a skiff, that's a small boat, and rowed ashore. The crew were given orders to stay on board the big ship. "Now we'll sneak up to the village and overtake them," said Jim. "Probably only women and children are at home." Yeah, said Buck, and besides, there are so many women in the canoes, I should think that only children are left on the island. I hope they're playing marbles. Ha 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 ha. His voice carried clearly over the water. Why? Shouted Pippi from the cave above. Do you especially like playing marbles? I think it's just as much fun to play leapfrog. Jim and Buck turned around in astonishment and saw Pippi and all the children sticking their heads out from the cave. A delightful grin spread over their faces. There, we have kids, said Jim. Perfect, said Buck. This is in the bag. But they decided nevertheless to play it safe and be sly. No one could know where the children kept their pearls, therefore it was best to try to win them over. The men pretended that they hadn't come to Crooked Island to find pearls at all, but were just out for a nice little excursion. They felt hot and sticky, and Buck suggested that to begin with they go for a swim. I'll row back to the island and fetch our bathing trunks, he said, and this he did. No, I'll row back to the boat and fetch our swimming trunks, he said, and this he did. In the meantime, Jim stood alone on the shore. Is there a good beach around here? He said. He called to the children in a friendly voice. Wonderful, said Pippi. Absolutely wonderful for sharks. They come here every day, you know. Nonsense, said Jim. I don't see any sharks. But he was a little worried just the same, because when Buck came back with the swimming trunks, he told him what Pippi had said. Nonsense, said Buck, and he shouted to Pippi, Are you the one who is saying that it's dangerous to swim here? No, said Pippi. I never said that. That's funny, said Jim. Didn't you just tell me there were sharks here? Yes, that's what I said, but dangerous? No, that I wouldn't say. My grandfather swam here just last year, she said. Well then, said Buck, and grandfather got back from the hospital already last Friday, Pippi went on, with the fanciest wooden leg you've ever seen on an old man. She spat thoughtfully into the water. So I couldn't really say that it's dangerous. Of course, a few arms and legs do disappear if one swims here, but as long as a wooden leg doesn't cost more than $1 a pair, I don't think you should deprive yourself of an invigorating swim just because of the miserliness. And she spit once more. My grandfather takes a childish delight in his wooden leg. He says it's absolutely irreplaceable when he goes out to fight. You know what I think, said Buck. I think you're telling whoppers. Your grandfather must be an old man. I'm sure he doesn't want to be in any fights. That's what you think, said Pippi in a shrill voice. He's the most ill-tempered old man who ever hit his opponent on the head on the head with a wooden leg. If he can't fight from morning till night, he's miserable. Then he gets into such a rage that he bites himself in the nose. What nonsense, said Buck. No one can bite himself in the nose. Yes, they can, said Pippi. He climbs up on a chair. Buck thought about this for a while, but then he swore, I don't feel like listening to your silly chatter any longer. Come on, Jim. Let's get ready to swim. Besides, I'll have you know that my grandfather has the longest nose in the world, said Pippi. He has 5 parrots, and all of them can sit next to each other on his nose. By now, Buck was really angry. You little red-headed vixen, do you know that you're the worst liar I've ever met? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Are you really trying to make me believe that 5 parrots can sit in a row on your grandfather's nose? Confess that it's lies. Yes, said Pippi sadly, it's a lie. There, you see, said Buck. Isn't that what I said? It's a terrible, horrible lie, said Pippi, still sadder. That's what I thought from the beginning, said Buck. Because the 5th parrot, sobbed Pippi and burst into a flood of tears. The 5th parrot has to stand on one leg. Get lost, said Buck, and he and Jim went behind a bush to get undressed into their swimming shorts. Pippi, you don't even have a grandfather, Annika said reproachfully. No, said Pippi gaily. Must I have a grandfather? Buck was the first one to come out in his bathing trunks. He made an elegant dive from a cliff into the sea and swam out. The children up in the cave watched with great interest. Then they spotted a shark fin, which floated above the surface of the water for a second. "Shark! Shark!" cried Momo. Buck, who was treading water and enjoying himself immensely, turned around and saw the terrible creature coming toward him. There has probably never been anyone who could swim as fast as Buck swam that day. In 2 split seconds he had reached the shore and rushed out of the water. He was both frightened and furious. It seemed as if he thought it was all Pippi's fault that there were sharks in the water. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, you nasty little girl?" he screamed. "The sea is full of sharks." "Have I said anything else?" Pippi said sweetly, and tilted her head to one side. "I don't always lie, you see." Jim and Buck went behind the bush to get dressed again. They felt that now the time had come to begin thinking about those pearls. No one could tell how long Captain Longstocking and the others were going to be away. "Listen, children," said Buck. "I heard someone say there were some good oyster beds in these regions. Do you know if it's true?" "I'll say," said Pippi. "Oyster shells go crunch, crunch under your feet wherever you walk down there on the bottom of the sea. Go down and see for yourself." But Buck didn't want to do that. "There are great giant pearls in every oyster," said Pippi, "about like this one," and she held up a giant shimmering pearl. Jim and Buck got so excited that they could hardly stand still. "Do you have any more of those?" said Jim. "We would like to buy them from you." This was a lie. Jim and Buck had no money with which to buy pearls. They only wanted to get them dishonestly. "Yes, we have at least 10 or 12 quarts of pearls here in the cave," said Pippi. Jim and Buck were unable to hide their delight. "Wonderful!" said Buck. "Bring them here and we'll buy them all." "Oh no," said Pippi. "What are the poor children going to use to play marbles with afterward? Have you thought of that?" There was a lot of discussion back and forth before Jim and Buck realized that it would be impossible to get the pearls by clever maneuvering. But what they couldn't get by clever maneuvering, they decided to take by force. Now they at least knew where the pearls were. The only thing they had to do was climb over to the cave and take them. Climb over to the cave. Yes, that was the rub. During the discussion, when it says that was the rub, it means that was the problem. During the discussion, Pippi had carefully removed the hibiscus rope, which was now safely in the cave. Jim and Buck didn't think that the climb over to the cave would look very inviting, but there didn't seem to be another way to get the pearls. "You do it, Jim," said Buck. "No, you do it," said Jim. "You do it, Jim," said Buck. He was stronger than Jim, so Jim started climbing. He frantically grabbed hold of all the jutting rocks he could reach. Cold sweat was pouring down his back. "Hold on, for heaven's sake, you won't fall," said Pippi in an encouraging way. Then Jim fell in. Buck was shouting and cursing on the beach. Jim was also screaming because he saw 2 sharks heading in his direction. When they were no more than 3 feet away from him, Pippi threw down a coconut right in front of their snouts. That scared those sharks just long enough for Jim to swim to the shore and crawl up on a little plateau. The water was running in rivulets around his clothes, and he looked miserable. Buck was scolding him. "Do it yourself, and you'll see how hard it is," said Jim. "Now I'll show you," said Buck, and he started to climb. All of the children watched him. Annika was almost a bit frightened as she watched him coming closer. Oh, don't climb there, you'll fall," said Pippi. "Where?" said Buck. "There," said Pippi, pointing. Buck looked down at his feet. "A lot of coconuts get wasted this way," said Pippi a moment later, when she had thrown one in the sea to prevent the sharks from eating up Buck, who was desperately floundering around in the water. But up he came, mad as a hornet, and he certainly wasn't going to be afraid. He immediately started climbing again, because he had made up his mind once and for all to make his way into the cave and get his hands on those pearls. This time he managed much better. When he was almost at the opening of the cave, he called out triumphantly, "Now, you little demons, this time you're going to get it." Then Pippi stuck out her index finger and poked him in the stomach. There was a splash. "You could at least have taken this with you when you took off," Pippi shouted after him as she threw a coconut bang on the snout of a shark that was coming too close. But more sharks came, and she had to throw more coconuts. One of them hit Buck on the head. "Oh dear, was that you?" said Pippi, when Buck yelled. From up here, you look like a big, nasty shark," she said. Jim and Buck now decided to sit it out until the children were forced to come down. "When they get hungry, they'll leave there," said Buck grimly, "and then they'll see something. He shouted to the children. "I feel sorry for you if you're going to have to sit in that cave until you starve to death." "Oh, you have a kind heart," said Pippi, "but you won't have to worry about us for the next 2 weeks. Then we might have to start rationing the coconuts a little." She cracked a big coconut, drank the milk, and ate the wonderful coconut meat. Jim and Buck swore. The sun was setting, and they began making preparations to spend the night ashore. They didn't dare row out to the steamer to sleep, because then the children could get away with all the pearls. So they lay down on the hard rocks in their wet clothes, and they were very miserable. Up in the cave, all the children were merrily sitting and eating coconuts and mashed breadfruit. It was so good, and the whole situation was so exciting and pleasant. Once in a while they could stick their heads out to look at Buck and Jim. By now it was so dark that they could see only a fuzzy outline of the men on the plateau below, but they could still hear them swearing down there. Suddenly there was a shower of the violent tropical kind. The rain came down in torrents. Pippi stuck the tip of her nose out of the cave. "You certainly are lucky ones," she shouted to Jim and Buck. "What do you mean by that?" said Buck. He thought that the children maybe had changed their minds and wanted to give them the pearls. "What do you mean by saying we're lucky?" he said. "I mean, just think how lucky it is that you are already soaked. You were already soaked before this rainstorm came. Otherwise you would have got soaking wet in the rain." More swearing could be heard from down on the plateau, but it was impossible to tell whether it was Jim or Buck. "Good night, sleep well," said Pippi, "because that's what we're going to do now." All of the children lay down on the floor of the cave. Tommy and Annika lay each on either side of Pippi, holding her hands. They were quite comfortable. It was so warm and snug in the cave, and outside the rain was pouring down. And that is the end of chapter 9. And the next chapter is chapter 10, and it's called Pippi Gets Bored with Jim and Buck. So we're going to hear more about Jim and Buck in the next chapter. Well, it's time to go. I hope you liked the story, and I'll see you next time, and I'm so glad you came. Bye-bye.